He surely will die. At last the food was ready. My stomach was growling for it by then. The music had finished, and Button the Fletcher and his wife Kate had left. As soon as Nick's little brother was asleep, Sarah Downey lowered him into a wooden crate and draped a linen cloth over him. Without saying anything to anyone, she opened the door and went out to her own cottage and her husband. Jack put down his empty mug and followed her. Wind and rain spat nastily into the room as they went. Meg ladled the broth into wooden bowls. The grandmother mumbled some kind of blessing over the bread and broke it. Nick poured more ale into the wooden cups and handed them round, and I felt as if I'd never eaten and drunk so well. Widow Susan was watching me all the time I was eating. The firelight showed her face creased and deeply lined, like a piece of bark, and her eyes were watery with smoke. She asked me my name, and I gave her the first but not the second. She tapped the ground with her foot. "Let me tell you something, young William. We keep no secrets here. We trust one another." Trust. That was such a strange word to hear. I hardly knew what it meant. Trust no one could have been written in Latin on any nobleman's coat of arms. "And let me ask you something," she went on. "You have a purse hanging on your belt, but you say you have no money in it. It is empty then, like a dead pig's bladder." Nick spurted his ale with laughter. It dribbled down his chin and he dabbed at it with the back of his hand. I shook my head. "It's not money, it's more precious than that." I was bleary with sleepiness and ale, or I would never have said so much. "Then let me tell you something else now. If it's more precious than money, it's not safe hanging around your belt. A boy dressed like you are now doesn't carry a good leather purse like that on his person. It belongs to a court popinjay, not a street sparrow. It'll be cut away in no time, I warn you." She sliced the air with her fingers. "Is it something you could wear round your neck?" Meg asked. "I could make you a strong braid for it. You could wear it under your shirt and no one would know it was there." Her voice was sweet, her eyes soft with caring. She reminded me so much of my sister Marjorie, only prettier, much prettier. "Nicholas, give the gentleman more ale," his grandmother said suddenly. "He needs to sleep well tonight." Nick grinned and poured more ale into my goblet, and like a fool I snapped it back. I longed for sleep. I would gladly have curled up in a box like a baby Arthur and let the purring of the fire sing me into my dreams. But the old lady wasn't ready to let me go to sleep just yet. She took off her coif and let her grey hair down, shaking it loose over her shoulders, drawing her fingers lazily through the thick strands. She hummed to herself while I took 2 or 3 long draughts of ale. Then she yawned deeply and carelessly. "Perhaps you should have let Meg have a look at it, whatever it is. Then she can see what she can do." I kept still, my fingers clutching the neck of my purse. "You don't want thieves snatching it as soon as you step out of here," she whispered, opening her eyes briefly and closing them again. "And I can make you a braid at first light," Meg said. She had a dimple when she smiled, I noticed. It came and vanished, came again and vanished in a fascinating way, like a rain or a pool. Marjorie used to sit with the end of a quill probing into her cheek, trying to give herself a dimple, but it never worked. I think it was Meg's dimple that finally made me give in. I pulled open the purse and drew out the ring. "This is all it is," I said, "just a simple ring. It was my father's, you see. Father's, grandfather's, great-grandfather's, and all those who went before him to the time when it belonged to the Plantagenet king, Edward II. But I wasn't going to tell them that." "Is he dead?" Widow Susan asked abruptly. "No, I don't think so." And falteringly, I told them about the last time I had seen my father, and that he had been dragged off to prison until he signed the oath of supremacy. "And this ring is to remember him by," Widow Susan said, "because he surely will die, child. You must know that. Let me have a look at it." I stared into the fire. My eyes were stinging now. "I must show it to Lord de Crecy at Greenwich Palace, and he'll save my father's life." I clutched the ring tight. My voice was breaking. "But I don't know how to get there or anything." "Show it me first." She held out her hand, and reluctantly I stood up and went round to her. She took the ring out of my palm and held it out to the flames. I thought she was going to drop it in, and I tried to snatch it back, but she snapped her fist over it. "I want to see it, boy." Meg and Nick crowded round to have a look. A log shifted in the fire. The baby shuddered in his sleep. I sank down onto my heels while Widow Susan turned the ring over and over, screwing up her eyes. "Bit thin, bit old. There's a device on it, but it's worn away. And a crest, she said. It's 2 griffins, I said. It's the family coat of arms. Old family, are you? I nodded, swallowing hard. Very old. The old woman looked up at me, her eyes shining like little coins in the dark pockets of her skin. An old family, she muttered. And how did your family get this ring, did you say? But no, I wasn't going to tell her that King Edward had given it to one of my ancestors. How could I trust her with a secret like that? It's my father's signet ring. It belonged to his father and my grandfather and so on. A powerful family, did you say? Did I? I had no idea what I'd said. The warm ale was slurring my speech and blurring my wits. Not any more, I said. All we have now is our name. Which is? Her eyes were dark and deep now, as she stared into mine, and I knew she was reading me as she had read my ring. Montague. There, she had pulled it out of me. Not one I know, but a very venerable name, I'm sure. The old woman nodded. And this ring is like to be hundreds of years old, just as you say, of course, she added. We come from a very ancient family ourselves. Do we, Grandmum? Meg's eyes were round with wonder. Course we do. Our family's been on this earth for hundreds of years, same as his. Everybody's has, since we're all descended from Adam. Only difference is we're common people and he's a noble. The peasants work the land and the rich folk own it, and it's always been that way and always will. Makes no difference to me. It's the way things are in this world. But our family name is as old as his, make no mistake about it. And we're all born naked, and we all finish up dead. She hooted with laughter and put the ring into my hand. You guard it well, she said. I hope this lordy crazy can work miracles for you. Nick will help you to find your way to him. God be with you tonight, if he spares you. She slapped her thighs and heaved herself up. I'm going out for a piss. The cold stream of air from the open door nearly flattened the fire. Meg dampened down the flames and tucked the cloth from tightly round the sleeping baby. Nick dragged a humped straw mattress across the floor so it was near the fire and spread a blanket across it for his grandmother. The old woman came back in and fastened the door, twitching a heavy woolen cloth across it. She handed Nick a smoking tallow candle, and Meg and I followed him up the creaking ladder to the loft. The straw was scratchy through the blanket and sharp with the smell of the wormwood they had used against fleas. I was afraid of rolling over the edge of the shelf onto the floor below. I lay awake, mumbling prayers for my father, listening to the coughs and snores from down below and the wind crooning round the cottage, and at long last, I fell asleep. On the way to Greenwich. I woke up with a start, trying to remember where I was. I could dimly remember the conversation of last night, the old woman's greedy eyes, her hands stretching out for my ring. Panicking, I groped under the straw mattress I'd been sharing with Nick. The purse was quite safe, with the ring snug inside it, and my dagger was secure in its sheath in my belt. There was no sign of Nick or Meg. I could hear the old woman chortling down below about something. The little child Arthur screamed for food and fell silent again. Then I heard the ladder creaking. Nick stuck his head over the top, grinning cheerfully. How you nobles do sleep, he said. Half the day is gone already. I would like to eat. I felt bewildered and afraid. I didn't know what to do or where to go or how to behave in this strange tiny house. Grandmam says if you're quick, there's some porridge left, and if you don't, the pigs will have it. How shall I get washed? I didn't like being washed, but I felt sticky and dirty and itchy with flea bites after my night on the straw. He wrinkled his nose as if the idea of getting washed was very strange. You can draw up water from the well, but you're going to have to bring it indoors in a pail. It's bitter cold out there this morning. And he disappeared again. I decided against washing. I crawled off the mattress and remembered I had no other clothes to wear anyway. I fastened my belt around my waist and patted my dagger and purse into place. The animals had been shooed outside, thank goodness, and Meg was sweeping their droppings after them. Her grandmother stewed a few fresh rushes behind her. The fire burned brightly in the middle of the room, and cold sunlight streamed through the open doorway, turning the smoke golden. Draw up a stool and eat, Widow Susan called to me, and then you'll be on your way. I sat down by the fire and waited to be served, but she bustled away and picked up her drop spindle, bobbing it at her side while she drew the dark thread up and down, up and down. Her hands were gnarled and cracked like splintered twigs. She waddled outside, calling, "Good morrow," to passing neighbours, as busy and bright-eyed as one of her hens. Sarah Downey slipped in like a silent cat, towed the last of the rushes into place, and picked up the infant, who had started screaming. She put him to her breast and held him tucked firmly in place with one arm, while she picked up a pail of scraps with the other and carried it out to feed the animals. Meg was milking the cow, singing dreamily to herself. She half turned her head as if she knew I was watching her, and smiled and nodded to me, which made me turn away, but I don't know why. I watched them all coming and going, busy with their work, and I realised that no one was going to serve me with food. I poured myself some ale, fetched a wooden bowl and spoon, and scraped the last of the porridge from the pot. As I sat down to eat, the grandmother, Susan, turned round from the doorway and grinned her gummy smile. "When you've finished, there's a pail of water to draw from the well, and the pot to be cleaned," she said. "You'll find a bunch of horsetail to scrape it out with." I blushed with anger. Surely she didn't expect me to do it. "And then Nick has a plan for you." I ate my porridge quickly and put my dirty bowl on the hearth next to the empty porridge pot, then hurried out to where Nick was loading his handcart with his straw baskets for the market. "What plan?" I asked. "To get to Greenwich. I'm going to take you down to the wherry now. The tide should be right if we're quick. And look, I've made you this to keep you safe." Meg came out of the cottage behind me, holding out a slim plaited cord. "Give me your ring, sir." I wouldn't do that. The cold daylight had cleared my head of any such foolishness. Instead, I took the cord from her and turned away so my back was to Meg and Nick. I slid my ring from my purse and threaded it onto the cord. "Will you let me, sir?" She was teasing me with her laughter, but all the time I let her help me. I clutched the ring the whole time while she stood on her toes and looped the knotted cord around my neck. Then she tucked it inside my shirt. Her fingers were icy cold, making my flesh tingle, but her breath was like warm feathers on my cheek. All the time the grandmother was watching us from the doorway of the cottage, her fingers twitching on the dark wool, her drop spindle bobbing like a wooden doll. "There now, you're quite safe," Meg smiled, stepping away from me. I remembered my courtly manners at last, and I bowed to her as if she was a maid-in-waiting, half mocking. She giggled and put her hand to her mouth in embarrassment. "You and Nick should hurry now." I hardly had time to thank them before Nick sped off. I did my best to keep up with him, and he kept stopping and hopping impatiently from one foot to another, waving me on. At last we arrived at the river. Boatmen crowded round the wharf steps, waiting to ferry people across the river. "Which one should I take?" I asked, gazing along the row of boats moored up to the bank. "And how will I pay?" "I'm going to ask one of the wherrymen to take us. If one of them remembers my father, we'll be all right. If not, we'll walk. Just wait here a bit." "I don't need you to come with me," I said. "I want to do this on my own." He took his hat off, turned it round in his hands, gazing at it as if it had words written all over it, if only he could read, then put it back on his head. "Fact is, sir, you do need me. You may be dressed like a common lad, but you don't talk like one. You see them beggars over there? They've got a language all of their own. That's how they talk to each other. I know their language because my family was begging just like them after my father went away. I know that language like you know that Latin language, and I can tell you which one is more important when you're out on the streets of London." I looked away, miserable. I knew he was right. Brother John had told me that Latin would take me anywhere in the world, but he never thought that I'd be homeless and fatherless in my own country. He must have known the language of beggars too. He had lived with them for long enough, but he never thought to teach it to me. "Next thing," Nick went on, "you don't walk like a common lad. You've got this sort of rolling swagger like I only ever see rich people do, like you've never got anything to spend your time doing. Look around you. Everyone's walking fast. Got to do this, got to do that, else they'll go hungry. You've got to learn to walk quick. Then you won't be noticed. You won't last a minute, not without me to watch out for you. I tell you, you've got eyes that aren't bright enough, and feet that aren't fast enough, and ears that aren't sharp enough. You do need me, sir, or you'll cut up like a rabbit for a stew pot in no time." My eyes were smarting. I wanted to block my ears so I couldn't hear his prattling voice any more. Why did my father have to be sent to prison? Why did my sister go to Calais? I was all alone in the world, and none of it was my fault. He went on relentlessly, Nick the chattering starling. "And when you get to Greenwich Palace, what then? What if someone sees you, or knows your face, or your voice? And you going to go marching up to those gates all on your own? How are you going to find the Lord crazy? You do need me, sir. You need Nicholas Drew." I choked back the sobs of misery that were rising in my guts and nodded blindly. I squatted on the wharf steps and left it to Nick to find us a boat. It helped to calm my nerves to watch the water. Nick worked his way along a line of bargemen and wherrymen preparing to go down river, babbling cheerfully as he went, till he found one who knew his father. I could hear his voice all the way. The last bargeman said he would let us on for nothing, as the boat wasn't full. There were some rich folk on board already, but I didn't recognise any of them. I kept my head bent down just in case, and my telltale red hair stuffed well inside my cap. Nick chatted to the oarsmen till they grew tired of him. Then he crouched down next to me, whistling brightly. Was your father really a wherryman? I asked him. Used to be. Then he went away to sea. I thought I'd never see him again, and he came back full of such wondrous tales that I wanted to sail away with him. He went to the lands that were so hot that people who lived there have no clothes on, and lands that were so cold that the sea around them got blocked up with ice for weeks and weeks on end, and the ships were stuck there like nails in a coffin. Imagine that, sir, like when the Thames freezes up, only it's sea like this. He held his arms out wide. And there's nothing for miles and miles of ice all around you. Oh, and it creaks and groans, my father says, like it was alive sometimes. His eyes were gleaming with the mystery of it. He folded his arms round his chest, hugging himself. One day, I'm going to be a sailor like my father. I'm going to sail around the world. I want to have adventures. I want to see everything there is to see, the monsters in the sea and the giants on the land. His mouth puckered. But I wish I knew where he is now, sir. I wish I knew I would really see him again. There are things he doesn't know, lots of things. He went so quiet and still then, as though he'd dropped into a deep well inside himself, that I thought he might be offended if I asked him any questions. Then he suddenly roused himself and said, For a start, he doesn't know that my mother's had a baby, does he? He went away 8 months before Arthur was born. Arthur's nearly 2 years old now and doesn't even know he's got a father. My father doesn't know that our Christian and our Henry took a sickness and died in the same week, just before last Christmas. His voice shook. My little brothers, they died. He doesn't even know that. And he doesn't know that we were turned out of our house because we had no money left. Mother was sick, so sick. She wouldn't talk or eat after my brothers died. I had to go begging, and Meg had to look after Mother and Arthur, and we had nowhere to sleep but edges. And then Mother died, and he doesn't know that. And then we came to Grandma Susan's house, and she let us stay with her. And Sarah Dowdy, she didn't know us at all, but Grandma asked her to feed the baby Arthur like she would feed her own, and she does. She's strange, and she doesn't talk much. She frightens me sometimes, the way she stares. But she looks after Arthur, so she's not a bad woman, is she? I shook my head, not trusting myself to say anything at all. But my father doesn't know any of that. He doesn't know where we live now, sir. That's what I dream every night. I dream that my father comes back home from the sea, and he doesn't know where to find us. Then Nick fell into a deep, gloomy silence, and I didn't know where to go to bring him out of it. I had never thought much before about the misery of other people, especially not common folk. Nick was nothing to do with me. His life was nothing to do with mine. The poor were lowborn, and that was that. They had to put up with whatever happened to them, but all the same, I knew how much he worried about his father. I could understand that, and I knew what it felt like when your mother had died, and your brother too. I knew about those huge, dark, empty spaces that would never, ever be filled again. Just at that moment, I knew that Nick and I weren't all that different after all. Because he wasn't talking, and because it hurt my brain to try and reason why God let such awful things happen to people, I concentrated on the other conversations that were going on in the barge. The young nobleman were laughing and gossiping. It was all noblemen ever did, I remembered. They were courtiers, I found out. After a time, they began to talk about Prince Edward, my little prince. My ears were scorching with straining to listen to them. My heart was pounding uncomfortably. I shifted on my bench and leaned forward and realised then that they were even talking about me. He just ran away, one of the young men said. No permission asked for, not a word of explanation, no goodbye, nothing. Perhaps he's dead, one of the others suggested. It's to be hoped he is. If he's not and he's found, and the king won't spare his life, that's for sure. You should have seen his rage when he heard about it. They say the boy was his favourite. Must have been, because he wasn't an aristocrat, you know. Not a Carew by birth, just a Montague. I felt Nick start beside me. I leaned forward, my hands covering my face. He came for some god-forsaken old manor house miles away. King Henry took a liking to him, you know what he's like, and gave him the job that should have been Percy Howard's in the first place. Percy was out of his mind with fury. He was sure to be the prince's page. Everybody thought so. I mean, he's the Duke of Norfolk's nephew. Well, when the boy's found, he'll be flogged in public. Hanged for treason, more like. What about the nurse? I heard she was punished for letting him go. Aye, Mother Jack was beaten and locked away, but the little prince pined for her and King Henry had her released. But he's to have a dry nurse anyway, Sybil Penn, now he's 2, so Mother Jack will be lucky if she can stay at Hampton Court. But do you know Sir Andrew, one of his Mistress' archers? Well, Sir Andrew was flogged, of course. He was the last to see the boy. He was having an archery practice with him. He refused to say where the boy had gone, poor fool. No, there's no doubt about it. If the Montague boy hasn't drowned or been stabbed by robbers on the highway, he's in for an even worse death when he's discovered. They tittered at the thought, and then their gossip moved on to other things. Nervously, I gripped Father's ring through my shirt. I felt that my world had truly gone dark as midnight. Greenwich Palace. I was sick with dread at the thought of arriving at Greenwich now. I wanted to cover my face and stay on the boat, but as soon as the nobles disembarked, Nick tugged my sleeve and hauled me off. "Now this is a grand place," he said, his arms on his hips, staring round at the green hills and banks, and then with a sigh of wonder, pointing out the beautiful palace beyond the bare trees. "Wonderful, that is. I always wanted to see that. Grandmam told me that King Henry was born here, and the Witch Queen set off from here on her wedding day, and it was a wonderful sight to see, because she was as beautiful as anyone could ever be, and all dressed in gold, and the river was like a scarf of jewels with all those painted boats and banners and streamers, and there were fireworks whizzing into the sky, and music everywhere. Did you know that, Master Will?" He turned to me, his eyes shining. "And then Grandmam says, no more than 3 years later, the same beautiful lady set off here again from here. Only this time she was going to the Tower of London to have her head sliced off. Did you know that too?" "Of course," I said. "Everybody knows." "Couldn't have thought much of her then, could he? He's always getting people's heads chopped off, Grandmam says." Then he dropped his voice to a whisper. "I heard those noblemen talking on the barge. That boy Montague that they were on about isn't you, is it? It's you, isn't it?" I nodded miserably. "The Prince's page." "Don't tell anyone," I muttered. He blew out his cheeks, indignant. "Course I won't. But weren't you scared when you served at King Henry's palace? I would have been." Nick was right. I'd always been scared, right from the minute I saw King Henry, even when he was being kind to me. What if he was there at Greenwich Palace now? Why hadn't I thought of that? And if he was there, his court would be there, all the Howards and prowling Percy and his father and the terrifying Duke of Norfolk himself. What if someone recognised me and dragged me into the king's presence? I could imagine his rage when he saw me. I could hear his bellowing anger when a great bull in a barn. And I knew what Nick would say next. He'd heard what the nobles had said about my favourite knight, Sir Andrew, flogged for helping me and Mother Jack. My throat was tight with grief at the thought of it, but that was how King Henry took his revenge. I knew how cruel he was. Everybody knew, but I never thought it would come so close to me. Brother John, Father, Sir Andrew, Mother Jack. Would I be next? And what about Nick, if he was found with me? It wasn't safe for him to be anywhere near me, least of all to be going to one of the palaces of King Henry with me. If I was captured, he would be too. I turned away, miserable and scared. The wherrymen were preparing to leave the steps. "You'd better go," I muttered. "I'm not going to leave you." "If that's what you mean," he said, shocked at the idea. He dodged round me so he was looking into my face again. "Master Will, we're not leaving now, either of us. We've come all this way, haven't we, safe and sound. We can't give up now. You must hide in those trees down there, and I'll go to the gates and ask if your Lord Crazy's here. If we can go to see him safely, I'll signal to you like this." He put his hands round his mouth and made the sweet fluting whistle of an oyster catcher. "Don't move from here if you don't hear that whistle, because I might come and fetch you, or even bring him to you if that's safer. I'll work it out." I nodded dumbly, too relieved to speak properly for a bit, but I was glad of his common sense. He had to be the one who'd go up to the gates and ask for Lord de Crecy, and if his lordship agreed to see me, I had my speech ready in my head. I would show him the Montague ring, I would go on my knee and beg him to help for my father. Surely he would listen to me. We watched the young noblemen from the barge strolling up the steps to the palace. Halfway up, 2 of them pretended to have a fencing match, while the other one whistled and cheered and capered round them. I suppose they were drunk. They thrust their imaginary swords towards each other. They twirled and bowed. They held a hand behind a back or daintily out at the side. They lunged and parried and feinted. I used to do that, I thought miserably. How foolish they looked. A little crowd gathered round them, laughing and clapping. "If they were real swords, one of them would be dead by now," I muttered. I wished they would get on with it, so I could do what I had to do, and then get away from Greenwich as fast as I could. At last they finished their sporting and ambled on towards the red brick palace. I hid in the shelter of the trees while Nick scuttled off. I felt sick with nerves, and hardly knew what to do with myself. I found a stick and tried to whittle a shape into it with my knife, but my hands were shaking so much that I stabbed my thumb. I kept squeezing the place where I'd cut myself and sucking the blood. It tasted like rusty nails. The dry leaves fretted above my head and branches scratched each other. The rooks croaked as they came down to roost, but there was no sweet whistling sound. The waiting seemed to last forever. Nick's gone, I thought. He's realised that it's too dangerous for him to stay with me, and he's gone. And then I thought, what if he gives me up to the guard at the gates? He might be hoping for a reward. They might come looking for me at any minute, and he might be miles away clutching a gold coin. I shrank back into the shadows. What could I do now? Nothing. Nothing but wait and pray. At last I heard the sound of feet padding quickly over the grass, and Nick was back at my side, alone. Is he coming? I asked. He can't. He bent over, panting his hands on his knees. Can't? I groaned. What, won't you mean? Why won't he come? Because he's been clapped in the palace dungeon, that's why. And he isn't likely to be let out till he's led to the gallows. I was as cold as stone then. Are you sure, Nick? Are you sure you asked for the right person? Lordy crazy. Like you said, the yeoman at the gate said his lordship refused to sign the oath of a premise you talked about. Oath of supremacy, I muttered. That's right. He refused to say that the king is the head of the church, so it's more money for the hangman. Nick squatted down next to me. His voice was husky with sympathy. You've lost your chance now, haven't you? I'm sorry for you, believe me, but we'd better be walking home. Take us about 2 hours at my pace and 4 at yours, so we'd better set off now while there's some daylight left. He was right. There was no point staying here anyway. The sooner we left, the better. There was nothing else we could do. I trudged behind Nick, and I could feel the signet ring knocking against my chest with every step I took. When we got away from Greenwich and the track was quiet of horsemen and beggars, I untied the cord and slipped the ring into my thumb, where it just fitted me. I felt closer to my father then, not so hopeless, not so afraid. For once Nick was quiet. There was no prattling left in him. I could hardly see his face any more, though the track was easy enough to follow in the dusk. We sank down and rested for a bit, back to back, and he began to sing in a croaky, tuneless voice. A frog could do better, I told him. He jumped up and stretched. We're tired, sir, and hungry, and I'm sorry for us both, but we have to get on. We can't be that far from our quarter now. Food, that's what we want. Fish pottage and ale, and some of Grandmam's wet suckets. He began to run, and I loped after him, and then stopped, winded and tired. What good would it do to go home with him? I didn't belong there. There was nothing more they could do for me. I slipped into a side alley and into a maze of dark streets. I didn't want Nick to find me. I didn't want to go back to his house, to his family, to the chortling widow Susan. I didn't want any of them any more. Attacked. I had no idea where I was going. I thought maybe I could find my way to Newgate from there, and somehow get a message to my father about Lord de Crecy. A misty sort of moon gave me just enough light to find my way down the alleyways, and I was glad of it. I slipped my ring off my thumb and fastened it back onto its cord for safety, then carried on. After a bit, I had the nervous feeling that someone was following me, footsteps clattering, stopping, clattering, stopping. I paused, and the footsteps paused too. My heart started thumping loudly. Before I could turn round, a hand came from behind me and grabbed me round the neck, and another came over my mouth, and I was hauled backwards onto the ground. A thick-necked man with breath like a dog's was peering into my face. I saw him upside down, could just make out his face glistening with sweat, black hairs curling from his nostrils, his eyes bulging out from his head. He kept one hand over my mouth and flashed a dagger into my face, and he was laughing at me as he used his knife to rip open the top of my shirt. His fingers groped for the cord. He snorted with triumph and wrenched it free. He held up my father's signet ring. That's a pretty trinket for a street urchin to be wearing. Where did you get it, you little thief? Could get you hanged for this, but I won't, 'cause I'm having it myself. Please don't take it, I shouted, grabbing his wrist. He punched my face so hard then I smashed back onto the ground. His boot came after, grinding onto my chest and then into my cheek. I clung onto his ankle, trying to bring him down so I could snatch back my ring. He thudded down, winding me as he fell. His knife flashed in his hand and he held it pointed above my face. I'll show you what happens to boys who fight back. He raised the knife, poised, ready to plunge it down into my neck, but he was suddenly grabbed from behind and hauled off me. He stumbled away, and my rescuer stumbled after him. I staggered to my feet. I was too scared to run after them, too shocked and winded, and I had no idea where they might be in the maze of dark passages. I put my hand to my face and felt the sticky ooze of blood. I crouched down on all fours, dizzy and sick and frightened. I didn't know what to think, what to do, where to go. My life had been saved, but my signet ring had gone. And the worst thing was, it was all my own fault. Why would anyone attack me? I was just an ordinary boy now. Whoever it was must have known about the ring. And this is what kept happening, coming back to me, kept tugging at my brains like a fish tugging at a hook. The only people who knew about my ring were Nick and his family. Why do you want to help me? I pulled myself up onto my feet and swayed like a drunken beggar, trudging through the alleys till I could feel the cold air coming off the river. I made my way to the bridge where Nick and I had taken the boat to Greenwich. Little pinprint reflections of light, candlelight in houses and shops gleamed like water on eyes on the water. I sat on the river steps, folding my arms tight across my chest to try and hold in the pain. It was bitterly cold. I kept thinking about Nick. He was just an ordinary boy, but he'd shown me more kindness than any other boy I had ever met. In the court, all the boys were jealous of each other. Nobody trusted anyone else. At home, at Montague Hall, the only boys I knew were servants and children of servants. My father had always treated them like members of the family, yet sometimes with Nick I even forgot that he was a commoner. I needed him to look after me. He was right, but I needed him for something more than that, something deeper, and I couldn't understand what it was. It was almost like the way I needed my father, needed my sister. It was almost like the way I needed Matthew. There was no way Nick would have sent someone to do this to me, I told myself. Not Nick. But if it wasn't Nick, or someone from his family, who could it have been? The receding tide had dragged itself away from the steps, leaving the stinking rubbish of the city behind, rotten, pulpy fruit and vegetables settling into the mud. In the moonlight, the bones of a dead donkey emerged from the slime. Its face was set in a hideous smile. What can I do? What can I do now? I moaned aloud, and still the donkey grinned, and I couldn't move, not even drag myself away from its stench. It was there that Nick found me hours later. It was day by then, tide coming back in, icy water lapping round my ankles. I heard feet pattering down the steps and felt someone squatting next to me. I could hear the grin in his voice as he spoke. You're as slippery as a fish, sir, and no mistake. I was following you, and you just went and disappeared clean out my sight. Lost him, I said to myself. Lost him good and proper now. And I hunted round all the nooks and crannies. No Master William. I was worried, I tell you. And then I followed my feet down here. And here you are, sitting like a sleeping duck with your head tucked into your belly. And, sir, I must warn you that you shouldn't be here. This is a dangerous place at night. You should never come out here without Nick to look after you. I uncurled myself and lifted my head to look at him. He clapped his hand across his mouth. Who did that to you? I'm too late, aren't I? You've been set upon, and I should have been there to protect you. Your face is as black and blue as a starling's wing, sir. You've been kicked and battered on in the end, and in no end of trouble. And where was I? Nowhere to be seen. That's where I was. Who did it to you? I don't know, I groaned. You can't do anything without me, sir. Remember that. Trust me, I won't let you down. I couldn't look at him. Didn't know how many times I doubted him. Didn't he know? Why do you want to help me, Nick? I'm just a danger to you. You know that now. I told you, I like adventures. Besides, we're all right, aren't we? If I was in trouble, you'd help me, wouldn't you? I tugged at my fastening on my boot. When had I ever helped anyone? Nick prattled on as if he hadn't even noticed that I'd hesitated. A gentleman needs someone to look after him, like a sheep needs a shepherd, like I need my guardian angel. He crossed himself quickly and glanced upwards as if he expected to see his angel there, wings spread out over his head like a tent in a storm. I think my guardian angel was with me last night. I told Nick about the rescuer who had come out of nowhere. I don't know who it was, but he saved my life and chased away my attacker. We didn't have wings, though. You sure it wasn't another robber, sir? They often work in pairs, often enough, like dogs in a pack. Only that second one saw that fine ring and thought, I'll have that myself, and he ran after the first scoundrel and stole it off him. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know anything. The one thing I did know was that my father's ring had gone. Who would believe my story now without it? and I had no idea whether my father was still alive. I groaned and covered my face with my hands, and the pain inside me was worse, much worse, than the pain I'd got from the attacker's foot on my face and my chest. "Oh, Lord, don't do that. Don't, Master Will," Nick said. "I'm here. You're not all alone, and you never will be." I didn't answer him. There was nothing he could do to help me now. "Isn't there anyone left in England you can go to?" I shook my head. I could feel the prickle of tears in my eyes, and I clenched my fists together. I had no idea where my Aunt Carew was now, but it was obvious that she would do nothing to save my father. Her own husband was the one who had caused him to be sent to prison, and she wouldn't do anything against Uncle Carew. The only friends of my father's that I knew of were staunch followers of the Pope. Most probably they were in jail themselves by now, like Lord de Crecy, or hanged. And if they weren't, there was nothing they could say or do to help him, even if they dared. There was no one in the world who loved and cared about him as much as I did. Except my sister. "There's Marjorie," I said, sitting up, "but she's miles away and she's married to one of the king's friends, a real nobleman, in France." "France?" Nick's eyes widened. "Where's that?" "It's over the sea." I was full of despair. France? It might as well be the moon, and the thought of the sea came lurching wet and dark at me, drenching me in fear. I sank my muzzy head down to my knees again. "So we can do it. We'll find a way. I'll be a sailor man at last. I'll ride the tides like a rich man rides his horse. I'll go to lands where the sun burns down all day, and the other lands where the ice is as thick as castle walls, and I'll see a great monster fish." I had to smile at him, even though it hurt my face to do it. "You ninny, Nick. France is only a few hours sailing time away." "Then there's nothing to stop us, nothing at all." "You aren't thinking straight, that's your trouble. Come home with me first, and Grandma will mend your bruises with herbs, and then, when you're better, we'll go there. We'll sail to France. We can do it." He helped me to my feet, but I found I couldn't walk. He half carried me up the steps and set me down so we could both get our breath back. My head was spinning with dizziness, and the movement had opened up my wounds and set me bleeding again. I was shivering uncontrollably by then. "You're feverish, sir," Nick said. "Let's get you home." Home. It was a good word to me that day, even though my fuzzy brain knew that he didn't mean the ancient golden walls of Montague Hall, nor my prince's red brick palace at Hampton Court. They would never be home to me again, neither of them. Home was a simple timber and mud cottage with a sagging thatched roof, and if I'd gone there last night, none of this would have happened. I needed to kneel on Nick at first because the robber had kicked my shins so hard and they had stiffened up while I slept on the cold river steps. But after a bit I wanted to walk on my own, and Nick let me. He kept glancing at me anxiously. I grinned at him to show I was all right, but I felt strange, dizzy and cold. So cold. Widow Susan tutted and fussed over me as if I was a child of her own family. She took some bunches of lavender that were hanging to dry in front of the window slit and set to grinding them with a stone and steeping them in oil. Meg drew fresh water from the well and warmed it a little over the fire so it wouldn't shock me too much, and gently bathed my face. Sarah Downey sat with baby Arthur at her breast, staring at me and gritting her teeth every time I winced. Then Widow Susan dabbed on the lavender oil, and though it stung, I managed to keep my mouth shut. She sent Meg to fetch more water so that she could bathe my shins, and tutting and hissing between her gums, she rolled up my hose and eased the blood-clogged cloth away from the wounds. "I must go to France," I murmured. It was all I could say. My teeth chattered together like stones in a riverbed. "You won't be fit to go anywhere yet," the grandmother scolded. "That villain nearly killed you, and I don't want him to kill you again. Not today, at least. I want you to lie down and get warm, because you keep shivering as if you wanted to shake your skin off your bones, and I don't like that. You won't get up that ladder. You'll open up all those sores if you try climbing. Try my mattress by the fire, and I'll get some good barley broth going for you. If anyone can get you well, old Susan can, but you must stay calm and warm for the next 2 days. She shuffled me over towards the fire. I was feeling dizzy by then and couldn't stop shivering. I let her lower me down onto the straw and cover me with her rough blanket. I could feel myself fighting against the cold surge of the sea. I was rising and falling, grasping blindly at nothing, choking at my mouth filled with water. I was heaved into air, and I felt the heavy drench of water dragging me down and down. I was heaved up again. I heard my father's voice calling. "Matthew! Matthew!" I tried to speak, but my mouth was full of water. "It's not Matthew, it's William." Then someone stroked my brow with something warm and sweet-smelling. I was home, with the fields golden with corn and dancing with poppies and daisies. I could hear the skylark churning and churning her silver song. I tried to open my eyes, but my lids were heavy, so heavy, and at last the sweet herbs and the purring fire soothed me into a long, deep sleep. Who can make you well again? When I woke up again, Marjorie was sitting up by my side, stroking my hand. I opened my eyes and smiled at her, and the shape dissolved and turned into someone who wasn't Marjorie at all, but just as gentle and just as sweet. "Who are you?" I whispered. She drew her hand away and stood up. "Grandmam, he's awake," she called. An old woman came and peered down at me, touched my cheek and helped me to sit up. "Take a sip of this," she said, and nudged my lips with the edge of a spoon. It tasted bitter and I turned away, pulling a face. "I've seen a dog smile sweeter than that. A little more, sir," she laughed. "Trust Susan. It tastes nasty, but it'll do you good." Susan. I remembered the name, and who she was, and where I was, and so the girl who wasn't Marjorie was Meg, and yet she had been stroking my hand. How strange that she should do that, but how nice too. And then the memories of last night came inching back. Meg cleaning my face, Nick helping me through the streets, the cold bite of the Thames around my ankles. I could feel myself limping and lurching down the dark passages, and before that, a man's face leering down at me as I lay helpless on the ground. What happened? In a panic, I felt for my ring. "It's gone," Widow Susan said. "Yes, sir, you remember it all now." She went outside and Meg with her. I shouldn't be here. I should be with my father. I struggled off the mattress and limped to the door. They were sweeping the yard between them, turning over the old dry rushes that had covered the earth floor of the house, stamping on the mice that scuttled out. Meg had Arthur dangling under one arm. When I appeared, Widow Susan looked round sharply. "Oh, he's up and walking like a corpse come to life. Where do you think you're going, young sir?" "To France," I said. "Nick," Widow Susan called, "there's a live skeleton here. He's awake." Nick was hauling a cartload of firewood towards the house. He dropped the shafts and came running to me, a huge smile on his face. "Are you better, sir?" "Oh, you look better, but you were so grimly pale before, I never thought you'd be moving about like this. Oh, it's good to see you, sir." "But if you think you're fit yet to go traipsing over the sea to France, you must change your mind," Widow Susan scolded. "Look at you, you can hardly walk. You need more of that tasty potion I made for you. See, he takes it now, Meg. It will keep him strong for his travelling. Who can make you better? Only old Susan. Remember that." Be safe, William. Be strong. It was true. My wounds were much better now, but I was still as weak and dithery as an old man. I let Meg lead me back indoors and sit me near the fire, and I drank more of the disgusting brew. She giggled at the faces I pulled. "Grandmam says it's worse it tastes, the better it is for you," she told me. "What is it?" "I don't know. She's going to teach me her arts one day, but I don't know much yet. I know one, but it won't help you much. I know how to grind the bones of a mouse in a mixture of roses and honey," she smiled. "It's for earache. Grandmam keeps most of it secret in her head, but she can make sick people better and dying people live longer or die easily out of pain." And that set me thinking and thinking. I glanced round at the bunches of herbs and jars of potion that she kept on the shelves. When the grandmam came back into the inn again to take up her drop spindle, I blurted out my thoughts to her. "Widow Susan, have you ever been to Newgate Prison?" She glared at me and crossed herself quickly. "What a question! I'm not a sinner, and if I was, I'm clever enough not to get caught. Newgate? It's death, that place. It's very death. It's worse than death." I shuddered. "I mean, have you ever been inside it?" She closed her eyes. "Aye, I have. I had a brother there once, and that's why my heart goes out to you, knowing your father is there. I went to visit my brother with my mother and father to plead for his life. We got nowhere with that idea. He was down in the pit they call limbo. Bodies lying on top of bodies. Filth like you've never seen, and a stench to make you empty your guts out. And the place crawling with lice and wriggling with rats. All we could hear down there was groans and screams, and it was so dark. We never even found our John. If we had, how could we have helped him? So we prayed for him to die quick and leave his misery behind. Like we tug on the legs of our hanging friends. Die, die, we tell him. Death's better than life when you're in that state." Meg had come creeping in and was crouching next to me. "I'm sure things would be better for your father than that." He would have some money, wouldn't he? He could buy a little comfort. Aye, and he won't be in limbo, Widow Susan agreed. That's for petty felons, whether they're guilty or not. I want to see him, I said. Will you take me there and help me to find him? And if he's sick or weak, as he will be, make no mistake about that. I took a deep breath. Then I want you to give him some of your potions to make him strong again. And be taken for a witch and thrown on the fire, she shrieked. Do you think I'm mad? But it's going to take me so long to get help for him. You must give him something to keep him alive till I get back. She leered her toothless face at me. Keep him alive, to suffer torture? Keep him strong enough to step on the hangman's trap? Is that what you really want? Please. Her chuntering stopped, her rhythmic spinning stopped, her eyes gleamed. You know so much, I whispered. You're so clever. Can you do it, please? Her grin turned from mockery to mystery, and at last she nodded. I'll do it, Meg. Meg, you'll have to help. She sent Meg running for water to boil and herbs to crush, peppermint and lavender, horseradish and others I'd never heard of, and all day there was grinding and boiling and muttering and strange smells rising and billows of steam like sails unfurling. I began to think she was truly a witch after all, and that her mumblings were spells and curses, and I was frightened because of what I'd asked her to do. But there was no stopping her now, no hushing the croaking of her singing. Behind her, the straw dragon's head that Nick had made leered at me out of the shadows, black smoke leaking out of its empty eye sockets. The fire sputtered and hissed under the boiling cauldron. At last it was done. She poured potions into little bottles, and Meg wrapped them in leaves one by one, and placed them in the rush basket, along with 2 stoppered jugs and Grandmam Susan's ale. Then Widow Susan put on her cloak and handed one to me. It was of brown wool, and she had made it for me herself and said, while I was ill, it was for my journey to France. It's a long walk to Newgate for someone in your state, she said, so we'll go slowly, but you'll have to come with me to point him out to me. I warn you, boy, he won't be a pretty sight to see. Don't speak to him, don't cry out or grieve, or say anything out loud to show that he's your father and you're his son, because if you do, they'll chain you up alongside of him, and you'll never get out of there till you're on a hangman's cart. Do you understand me? I nodded. Fear rose up in me again, blinding my eyes. Meg held out a little circle of twisted cord and slipped it over my hand onto my wrist. I've made you an amulet to guard you against evil. Be safe, William, she whispered, shy now. Be strong.